what are some of the key risk mitigation strategies or tactics that can be utilised. And let's have a look at covering the policy area with Costa.
Thank you, Inga. So my recommendation would be that employers review their existing policies to ensure that they are adequately clear and cover the new situations that they will be faced with, or ensure that they've got existing policies in place to address that situation. So my focus would be on workplace health and safety policies, flexible working arrangements, mandatory vaccinations, and leave. So those are the 4 key areas that I think employers should be looking at, and often those are interlinked with other existing policies. But starting off with workplace health and safety policies, particularly in Australian legislation, we are required as employers to consult with employees when it comes to reviewing the health and safety obligations within a workplace, and make sure that the measures that we've taken are in fact reasonable and adequate to mitigate any risks. So issues that employers need to look at are obviously protecting employees, but also protecting contractors and their customers, and ensuring that the measures that they have in place, including the workplace environment that employees are expected to work in and customers enter, is in fact safe, particularly from a COVID perspective. Protecting vulnerable employees or workers is of particular importance in that regard. And in that respect, I think employers should consider employees that have got pre-existing illnesses or injuries, which may be adversely affected by COVID, or employees like pregnant employees, given that I understand that the risks that they may face are in fact higher, and ensure that their policies take those issues into account and set out how those type of matters will be addressed. Naturally, systems of work should be reviewed, and practical measures that we all are familiar with by now, such as sanitizers, masks, social distancing, are looked at. But I think a more topical issue is airflow, particularly in office environments. And I think that's becoming an issue that's becoming more and more of a contentious one, because you often have employers leasing premises, and they need to work with landlords when it comes to ensuring that proper ventilation exists in the workplace. And there's various experts who have given recommendations and suggestions about how much airflow needs to go through a particular room in certain time limits, whether or not there's adequate filtration, using measures such as ultraviolet light, for example, or other filtering to limit the exposure of employees and customers to potential risks of the virus. So that is going to be, I think, one of the biggest aspects that employers need to grapple with, given that it's likely to result in significant costs. And that's something that I'm anticipating with time, even governments might need to consider. And then finally, mental health. I think that's a big part of workplace health and safety considerations, and whether or not employers have taken adequate measures to ensure that employees' mental health is adequately complied with. And for example, having an employee assistance program in place and engaging experts that can assist employees should they feel the need to access those type of counseling services, I think are critical. Moving on to the next policy that I think employers need to consider would be flexible working arrangements, including working from home, depending on the nature of the employer's industry. And currently, employees don't have a automatic right to flexible working arrangements unless they meet certain criteria. Often those relate to being in the workplace for at least 12 months and having carers commitments or some type of disability, or being over a certain age, or, for example, being a victim of domestic violence. And in those circumstances, employers need to make sure that they've got proper policies in place that are able to accommodate those requirements of those employees, whilst at the same time reasonably taking into account the needs of the business. So while employees will have rights in those circumstances, it very much depends on whether or not an employer's business can reasonably accommodate those type of flexible working arrangements. So those are issues that employers, I think, need to look at. Insofar as employees may be working from home, there's additional challenges, such as whether or not the setup in the working from home type of arrangement is safe, and whether or not an employer can monitor an employee's work while they're working from home. There's confidentiality obligations that employers need to address, given that employees working from home will be exposed to confidential information, particularly in professional industries. And then the practical issue of connectivity to others, and how to deal with that. And I can see that new types of managers will be required to deal with those type of issues and ensure that employees that are spread across a wide area have got that ability to connect with one another and feel part of a workplace, as opposed to be feeling that they are individuals working in isolated capacities. Next policy that employers need to consider would be in relation to mandatory vaccinations. And that is also a very contentious issue because, as John Boardman indicated previously, employees do have a right to privacy, but ultimately employers also do have to comply with directions from, for example, the government in the form of public health orders, and also comply with their health and safety obligations. So, in circumstances where an employer in specific industries is required to ensure that their employees are vaccinated, such as aged care or hospital environments, etc., ultimately the needs of the employer and the nature of the work that the employer performs, I think, need to take priority in some circumstances. And where an employee refuses to be vaccinated, they will be obliged to disclose to the employer any medical reasons for their refusal to undertake vaccinations. And then the employer can consider what measures they may take in order to address that, including potentially redeploying employees. So there's going to be a lot of complicated issues that employers need to consider. Obviously, in other workplaces where there's no specific obligation for under public health orders for employees to be vaccinated, there is an overall health and safety obligation that an employer needs to meet, and that is also going to be a challenge. And I think employers will very much need to be guided by experts, and particularly medical evidence and advice. But as I think John indicated earlier, information is critical, and being able to communicate that to employees is vital. And that's why having clear policies dealing with those type of issues, I think, is a step in the right direction. And then finally, policies in relation to leave. The requirement for an employer to direct an employee to be vaccinated is subject to, obviously, reasonableness. And if an employee is going to sustain some side effects because of any vaccination, then that's something that an employer should accommodate from a leave perspective. That's separate to the existing rights that employees have to take personal leave or sick leave. And also where an employee has an adverse reaction, that is also something that I think needs to be accommodated. So those are the key areas that I think employers need to focus on. And I think the critical aspect of all of this will be working together with employees and communicating with them so that everyone can have an opportunity to provide input in the formulation of these policies, and everyone can feel that they are part of a team working together and going in the same direction, as opposed to being directed to do something.
What about the worker, Costa, who feels significant anxiety being in the workplace, either because they are assuming that certain fellow workers haven't been vaccinated, or there has been a case in the workplace of a worker, not necessarily tier 1, could be tier 2, but ultimately, how should employers be responding to fear and workers that don't want to come to work as a result of assumptions that they might be making or facts that they do know?
Yeah, no, look, that's a good question, Stephen. And I think that's a situation that I think a lot of employers will be encountering. And ultimately, I think it goes back to the importance of communication, and employer being able to address those type of concerns up front, first of all, by having regular communication with its employees, not only in the form of policies, but actually direct communication, whether that's one-on-one or in group meetings, and assuring employees that, look, if they've got any concerns about these matters, there are processes that they can follow, and that they should not be directing those type of concerns to any other employee, because that's likely going to create grievances or friction between workers. So in those situations, they should explain to employees the processes that they can follow in raising concerns, and how those concerns will be dealt with. But yes, that is a scenario that's likely going to happen. But ultimately, employees' privacy is something that needs to be respected. And, the vaccination status of other employees is something that, workers will not be obliged to disclose to others. And it's something that is ultimately a matter between the employer and the employee to address themselves. So, it's going to be a very challenging time, but I think as long as clear communication exists, that should go a long way towards helping those type of issues being resolved amicably.
Stephen, one other dimension to this when we're talking about that is a lot of people work in a highly unionised workforce, and the role of the union in those particular organisations will be absolutely critical. A lot of the work health and safety representatives are also union representatives, that the union has quite well developed OH&S capacities. They have close working relationships with the inspectors from Safe Work Victoria, for example, have powers to be able to inspect workplaces in regard to their health and safety commitment. And if there's an adversarial a relationship and that there is differing information put out, then that's going to lead to not only confusion but distrust. So it'll be really important for those organisations to work through their existing systems for joint communication and the certain powers under the Act. I noticed just in the last day or two that there's been some media publicity around the fact that a gentleman by the name of Marty Blight, who was only 46, who died with COVID, that he worked at a Serco call centre, and that the ASU have now called in WorkSafe inspectors, and effectively what they've said is, well, if they weren't compliant to their duties under the Act, then they'll be held fully accountable to the Act. So there's not going to be any indemnities because people are finding their way on this. We know that the government said if a medical practitioner is vaccinating somebody and they end up having an adverse reaction to that the government would indemnify that medical practitioner. There is no indemnity for employers. It is still their responsibility to provide a safe work environment. And so it'll need consistency of message and information, and in some industries that will be easier than others. We know that in the nurse union, for example, that their federal secretaries come out quite strongly in favour of the mandatory vaccination, but that won't necessarily occur across the board.
So Costa talked about reviewing working from home flexible working policy. This has obviously had to change very quickly for many businesses during COVID. I just want to open this up to the group. How do you see this being managed going forward? Perhaps we start with Stephen.
Well, I think organisations have to be able to, first of all, achieve their goals in the best structure of work possible. So if flexibility helps them to achieve their goals in the best possible way, and the staff are keen to retain some of the habits that have been gained over the last 18 months, 19 months of working at home, and it's beneficial to them and the business, then it's time to review your policies, as Costa was saying before. It's time to review your policies around flexibility. But the most important aspect to all of this is that we're going to all be learning over the next period of time of what works best for our businesses. And to go in with an open mind will be very, very important.
And if I might say, even at a lower level, not just policies, as I think Costa may have indicated, just standard operating procedures. You know, if you're in a production line and you've got to socially distance, or if there are things, then there's a whole lot, all of those things, those standard operating procedures are all documented. There are committees that look at their development. So there's a whole lot of things that would need to be looked at. Some of those would have already been done. And my view is, so that it doesn't overwhelm people, look at what infrastructure and processes you currently have and adapt them. So often there are grievance procedures, there are investigation procedures and protocols in organisations. They might need to be reviewed, but then it's so, you might be conducting interviews, as we've had to do in the past, over a virtual platform such as this. And that brings a different dynamic to if you're dealing with somebody who is fragile and you have a difficult conversation with them, when you hit that leave button, are they okay in terms of, their mental health? And that's where I think Stephen's point of view is it's really important to try and build on what we have. Now, that'll be more difficult for smaller organisations that may not have much of that infrastructure in place. And if that's the case, then my view is a lot of those people will need to buy it in. Because they'll need it instantly. They can't wait to build it from the ground up. And now some of it they will have, but there might be other elements that they won't.
Great. Thank you, John. So just getting back to the question of some of the key elements to address risk mitigation strategies and tactics that can be utilised, culture plays a very big part, obviously, in this. So, Stephen Bell, what can you tell us about how culture can be best utilised to address risk?
Accepting that risk mitigation starts with workplace culture. You can have all the policies in the world, all the processes in the world, but it's about how people think, the way things are done around here. So in all the IHR training that we run, we talk about a culture model, and that culture model talks about culture, as I was suggesting, being the way we do things around here, and that ultimately it's what leaders say, what they don't say, what they do, what they don't do, that drives the type of team culture that we ultimately end up with. And the culture of compliance to COVID regulations, a culture of compliance in a new world that's going to be ever-changing, is going to first and foremost require leaders to be accessible to their people and to be somebody that their team can talk to, and talk to about their fears, about their frustrations, and about what's working and not working from a compliance point of view. Because I have no doubt that the compliance piece will be a little bit of a changing feast as we go along. And that will require a culture where people can have discussions. And some of those discussions can be had as a group, as Steve Booker was suggesting before. But a lot of those discussions will need to be had one-on-one, because there'll be ultimately often very personal views about these matters that people want to discuss, especially about their personal fears. So the culture of an organisation and the ability to approach a manager about fears and worries and concerns and conflicts will be an essential to risk mitigation going forward.